Rubicon is one of the very first history books I ever read, and it started my obsession with history. This book is about the collapse of the Roman Republic, and this specific period of history may be the most urgently relevant history you can read. The crazy part about this book is, it's also one of the most accessible entry points into history. Whether you've never picked up a history book or you've read dozens, you need to read this book. So, we're going to talk about how I first came into contact with Rubicon, why I was drawn to it, what the book is about, what I like about the book, what I didn't like about the book, why it's so relevant today. I was initially drawn to Rubicon because I was interested in learning Roman history, and I didn't really know much about Rome. I started listening to a couple podcasts, one of which was The Rest is History. I tried a couple of episodes, and the host of that podcast said that he had written a book called Rubicon, which is about the fall of the Roman Republic. I tried it out, listened to the first couple chapters, and I was blown away by the dramatic stories that this book tells and the great authorial voice in which the stories are presented. So, what Rubicon is really about is the fall of the Roman Republic. So its transition from being a republic into an empire. When Julius Caesar takes control, is murdered, and then Caesar Augustus becomes the first emperor of Rome and radically and fundamentally changes the structure of the Roman government until the empire's fall. This book really focuses on the steps that led up to these moments, the dramatic persons, the incredible stories, and the political shifts that allowed such a tragedy to happen. This book also brings in some of your really iconic household names in history. Think Julius Caesar, think Cleopatra, think Pompey, Crassus, and many, many others. If you want to know about these like titans of human history, I think this book is a great entry point. It's around 400 pages. I think a 16 hour audiobook, very well narrated, and it's got some great pictures and maps in here as well, which is a huge plus in history books. There's Pompey. There are a ton of reasons why I really like this book. Probably the number one reason is the incredible characterization that Tom Holland uses. I feel like the iconic historical figures that you've always really wanted to know about really come alive in this book. I think Holland focuses a little more on the drama of the story, which makes it a really interesting read. You get these amazing scenes like Cleopatra rolling herself in a rug to secrete herself into the heavily guarded fort where Julius Caesar is so she can make a deal with him. Some of which may not be 100% true, but I really appreciate Holland's inclination to not shy away from the parts of the story that may be a little bit sensational, because not only does it make for a much better story, but I think it presents the story in a way that was believable to those of the time. Some of these stories come straight from the historical records, whether or not these records were true, but also make a point about the character and the personality of these historical persons. I also really appreciated this is something I like in almost all history books. If your history book can do this, it's a winner for me, is the humanization of ancient societies and the ability to portray ancient cultures and societies in a relatable way where we as the readers can see ourselves in those societies. I think because of the vast gaps of time that have passed since these events, it's easy to view people that lived that long ago as almost a historical other, of like they didn't really experience the same emotions or feelings that we do. And that's just so wrong. These guys were humans, and that's one of my favorite things in history, is when books reveal the humanity of these characters. And it makes it that more relatable, and it also pounds home the decisions and the emotions that these characters were feeling. A great example of this is this little anecdote of Marius that he includes, who's this pretty famous Roman general. He's getting older in years, and so he ends up retiring and going to live in his villa in the countryside. And all these, the details of this villa and this like countryside town of Baiae and the storied oyster beds that lay there. It's just so interesting to learn about how these rich Romans loved their delicacies and the pleasures of life. But specifically this story about how there was all these rumors as he's getting older in age that he's combating weight problems. He's getting a little pudgier. And people are saying that he's not as powerful as he was before, he's getting old. And so he stages public workouts every morning to combat these rumors that he's getting unfit and to portray himself as, this virile, masculine man, even though he really has moved into retirement. But he goes on to do some interesting things. But that's just a great example of a story that really, what a fun story to know. To get into the intricacies of what these figures were worrying about, how they were trying to posture themselves politically and socially. And when you understand these characters like that, these massive moments where they're leading rebellions and toppling governments and infighting at the highest levels become a lot more interesting. I'll also give credit for really great prose. Tom Holland's voice here is really well done, super approachable, super readable, but it also offers an air of depth and vividity that is really pleasing. The audiobook is also really great. I would recommend getting this book as audiobook because he narrates it himself, and he's a podcast host, so he's got a pretty great voice. It's a great British accent. It's really easy listening. It flies by. Now, what I didn't like as much, honestly, there's really not a lot here. I really loved this book. This was a 5 out of 5, 6 out of 5 stars for me. One of the best history books I've ever read. There's 2 things I'll say about it. The first is I personally really liked the focus on some of the more trivial or sensational stories, but other readers prefer a more factual approach that's not, or a drier approach perhaps. I don't think there's anything wrong with this book, or I don't think there's anything that is an error in the reporting of this book, but some readers may prefer a drier approach to a timeline. And also, because of the selection of stories that Tom Holland has decided to include in the book, there are some major moments that are left out, perhaps with good reason, but specifically one that I felt was missing was the story of the Gracchi brothers and their impact on social and political change within the Republic. I felt that there are parts of the story that could have really benefited the book. However, there is 2 20-minute episodes from the History of Rome podcast that cover it perfectly. So just take a break for listening and go over to that podcast for 40 minutes and you'll get most of the history. So honestly, not that bad of a mission. I saw another comment on the exclusion of the Gallic campaign when Caesar is conquering the Gauls. It talks about it briefly, but that's not really the focus of the book. And so that really didn't bother me as much because it just didn't seem relevant to the story that Holland was trying to portray here. I think it's interesting history and there's definitely a lot to go into. But the reader of this book specifically, I don't think is as interested in the Gallic campaign throughout this narrative. I probably will go revisit that at another time, but I didn't really care that much. Why this book is so relevant is because it may be a little cliche to say this, and Tom Holland even points it out in the first chapter of his book. He says, "Indeed, since I started writing this book, the comparison of Rome to the modern day United States has become something of a cliche." But it's a cliche for a reason. Current events mirror so many of the things that were happening in ancient Rome. How their government was structured, the class systems, the wealth inequalities, and I think the collapse of the Roman Republic is particularly poignant to the intense political divides that we see today and the collapse of many of the checks and balances in the American political system and the collapse of some of the more smaller civic freedoms. To just lift off several of the parallels that I drew, there's an unprecedented voiding of government and systemic norms in the search of power. There's incredibly powerful men with access to insane resources that can create private armies and upend politics by mobilizing mobs and prior soldiers. There's an insane rise in populism and the ability of the politician to pander to the lowest common denominator and mobilize mobs to harass political dissidents. There's grain riots over the prices of grain, riots and reforms over land ownership, which, food prices and housing prices, like, could not be more relevant. And so I think the story that this history tells and the effects of some of the rampant inequalities and egos of insanely powerful and well-born men shadow a direction in which the world could possibly be moving if we do the exact same things that Rome did. And this book shows that there are some defining moments that capitulated on the collapse of the Republic, but it didn't quite happen overnight. It was a slow erosion of institutional norms that happened over and over again through a long period of time. Overall, I think you really need to understand this history. This book is for both those who have never read a history book and those who have read many books about this time period before. I think the prose is really approachable. It's a really enjoyable read. And it impacted me because of the humanization of the historical figures, the incredible drama that is presented here, juicy stories with betrayal and love and seduction and politics, death, power, and the incredible relevancy and parallels between Roman times and today. Also, Rome is just cool. Like, I'm a guy. I think about Rome once a day. I really appreciate the history that we see portrayed in this book. Another recommendation from me, if you do enjoy this book, would be to listen to the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan, I believe. And he also has a book about the similar time period. I think it actually is the exact same time period, called The Storm Before the Storm. Yeah, check these books out, and I implore you, please read or listen to Rubicon. You can get through it really fast. It's not too long. It's really approachable. And if you want any more Roman content, I have a video about my experiences with the board game Concordia, which is about being a trader in the ancient Mediterranean under the Roman Empire. So go ahead and check that out. I also have a review for another history book which I really liked, called The Middle Kingdoms, up on my channel. So check those out too. And we will see you later.